Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is being buried. A body lowered into the ground, a coffin, flowers. People standing in the rain who don't know what to do with their hands. We treat this like it's the natural thing to do with a dead human being. Like it's obvious, like it's always been this way. It hasn't. For most of the time our species has existed, we did not bury our dead. We did not mourn them in any way you would recognize. What we actually did, what the bones and the caves and the stone tools tell us we did, is something that no history class ever taught you. Something that most researchers still don't like saying out loud at conferences. But the evidence is there. It's been sitting in the dirt for thousands of years. And the more of it we find, the harder it gets to look away. Let's start with a number, 300,000 years. That's roughly how long modern humans have existed. And for most of that time, the archaeological record is almost silent on the question of burial. No graves, no grave goods, no flowers, no markers, no ceremony. The oldest confirmed intentional burial is around 100,000 years old, which means there are 200,000 years of human history, 200,000 years of people dying, that we can't fully account for. So what were we doing? Here's one answer. In 1994, in a cave in Atapuerca, Spain, researchers found the bones of at least 28 individuals, men, women, children, all thrown into a single pit. No grave goods, no careful arrangement, just bodies stacked. The site is 430,000 years old, which means it wasn't even made by Homo sapiens. It was made by our predecessors. And to this day, nobody fully agrees on what it means. But that's not even the disturbing part. The disturbing part is what researchers found on the bones themselves. Cut marks, thin precise lines made by stone tools. On the skulls, on the long bones of the arms and legs. The same marks you find when an animal is being processed for meat. Not on one skeleton, on many of them. Across dozens of sites, across hundreds of thousands of years. And the question that follows, the one scientists have been quietly arguing about for decades, is the one we're going to spend the next few minutes answering. Were those marks left by enemies, by strangers, or by the people who loved them? To understand what our ancestors did with their dead, you have to understand one thing first. For most of human prehistory, survival was the only agenda. Every calorie mattered. Every hour of daylight mattered. A dead body was not a tragedy to be processed. It was a problem to be solved, and different groups of people solved it differently. Some abandoned the body where it fell. Some moved it away from camp to avoid attracting predators. Some, the evidence suggests, did something else entirely. This is where it starts to get uncomfortable. The site is called Bodo. It's in Ethiopia. In 1976, researchers found a human skull there, 600,000 years old, with cut marks on it. Deliberate, careful cut marks running along the cheekbones, across the forehead, down the base of the skull. The pattern is identical to what you see when a hide is being removed from an animal. Someone, something that was very nearly human, had defleshed this skull, scraped the face clean with a stone tool. We don't know why, that's the honest answer. We don't know if it was violence, ritual, or something we don't have a word for yet. But we know it was intentional, and we know it wasn't isolated. Similar marks have been found at sites across Europe and Africa, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. At Grandolina in Spain, 800,000 years ago, the bones of children were processed the same way as deer and bison found at the same site. Same cut marks, same breakage patterns, same extraction of marrow from the long bones. Paleoanthropologists who study these sites don't use vague language about what this means. They call it what it is. But here is the detail that most people never hear. At many of these sites, the human bones are not mixed randomly with animal bones. They are separated, arranged differently, treated with a kind of consistency that suggests the people doing this understood they were dealing with something different from an animal, something that deserved, or required, a specific process. That is not the behavior of people who saw no difference between a dead person and a dead deer. That is the behavior of people who had beliefs. And what those beliefs looked like, what they demanded, is the part of this story that nobody saw coming. Gough's Cave, Somerset, England, 15,000 years ago. By this point in history, humans were not struggling to survive. They were sophisticated. They made tools, wore jewelry, painted caves. They had language, they had culture, they were, in every meaningful sense, us. And in this cave, they were doing something that takes a moment to fully absorb. Researchers found the remains of at least 5 people. The bones had been methodically processed. Skulls cleaned of flesh, facial bones removed. The top of each skull carefully shaped into a rounded bowl. Not broken, shaped. with the same patience and precision you'd use to make a tool you intended to keep. The long bones had been split for marrow. The smaller bones had been chewed. Then, and this is the part that stops most people cold, one of the forearm bones had been decorated. A zigzag pattern carved into the surface after the meat was already gone. Somebody sat down with a full stomach and made art on a human bone. Now here is what makes this impossible to explain as desperation. The same cave contained abundant animal remains: horse, red deer, Arctic hare. The people in Gough's cave were not starving. They had options. They chose this. Researchers who published the analysis in the Journal of Human Evolution didn't soften the conclusion. They called it customary, meaning it wasn't a crisis response. It was normal. It was what you did. And Gough's cave is not alone. Across Europe, in France, in Germany, in Croatia, in Belgium, archaeologists have found the same pattern. Human bones processed with the same techniques, the same cut marks in the same locations, the same marrow extraction. Different caves, different centuries, sometimes separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The same ritual, repeated, which forces a question that is genuinely hard to sit with. If this was happening across an entire continent, across thousands of years, among people who were otherwise building complex societies, what did it mean to them? What story were they telling themselves about what they were doing? Because some anthropologists who study living cultures today have found a possible answer. And it is not what you expect. In several documented societies, consuming the dead is not an act of violence. It is an act of love, a way of keeping someone inside you, literally forever. Which makes the bones in Gough's cave look completely different, and makes the next question unavoidable. The four people of Papua New Guinea ate their dead until the 1960s. Not as an act of savagery, as a funeral rite. Women and children consumed the flesh of deceased relatives because they believed it was the most respectful thing they could do. To let a body rot in the ground was, to them, the disturbing option. Keeping someone inside you was how you honored them. We know this in unusual detail because of what it cost them. A prion disease called kuru spread through the community for generations, transmitted through the consumption of infected brain tissue. It was fatal. They kept doing it anyway, because to them, stopping would have meant abandoning the dead. That is not the behavior of people without values. That is the behavior of people with very strong ones. And here is where this stops being ancient history. Somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, something shifted. Graves start appearing in the record. Bodies laid out carefully, oriented in specific directions, sometimes dusted with red ochre, sometimes buried with objects, tools, shells, beads. The dead being given things they might need, which only makes sense if the people burying them believed something was continuing after death. That the person was going somewhere. That is the moment modern religion begins. Not in a temple, not in a text. In a hole in the ground with a body in it and someone standing over it who couldn't accept that the person was simply gone. Every afterlife ever imagined, every heaven, every reincarnation, every ancestor spirit traces back to that moment, to that refusal. And now think about what you do when someone you love dies. The wake, the funeral, the grave you visit years later. The specific way you can't throw away their things. The way their voice stays in your head long after they're gone. That is 300,000 years old. That is not a custom. That is a feature of the human brain, carved in by generation after generation of people who stood over bodies and felt the same thing you feel. The rituals changed. The grief didn't. So the next time you're standing at a graveside, not knowing what to do with your hands, you're doing exactly what your ancestors did. You're trying to figure out what death means. Just like the person who carved a zigzag pattern into a forearm bone in a cave in Somerset 15,000 years ago. You still don't have an answer. Neither did they.